running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Such was the simile that occurred to him. Well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die.
Top of page
He pictured
610.
the boys finding his body next day. Suddenly he found himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And still with them, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore, for even then he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable, and smoking a pipe. "You were right, old hoss, you were right," the man mumbled to the old-timer of Sulphur Creek. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the twilight drew on, its eager yearning for the fire mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of forefeet, it whined softly, then flattened its ears down in anticipation of being chidden by the man. But the man remained silent. Later, the dog whined loudly, and still later, it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew, where were the other food providers and fire providers.
Okay, let's go ahead now and annotate for a few moments this story. Let's start at level 1 just to finish. The way the story ends, fairly predictable. He does freeze to death. The dog, who was along for the ride, if you will, goes ahead and just starts then moving towards where he knows there will be fire and some kind of possible way to save himself. Let's now turn to 2A. What are some possible messages or themes of a text like this? Well, let's just list a couple, shall we? Obviously, one is, what is the famous motto? Be prepared, right? Be prepared. And so that's an easy one, isn't it? If you're going to go into survival circumstances, you better be prepared. But the story can also be read as metaphor, can't it? Notice that his last conversation in the story is with the old-timer. The one who had given him the advice. The one that he had not listened to, but now he admitted, "Oh, you were right." Now, of course, this is the story at 3A that we know from Greek mythology as Daedalus Icarus. So let's write this one down at 3A. London obviously is playing a little game here that goes way back in time to the Greeks. The famous story of Daedalus Icarus. Daedalus is a famous inventor. He ends up with his boy caught in a prison, and he says to his boy Icarus, "I have a plan. I will build wings that you will put on. And when you jump out of the window, you'll be able to fly away and we'll be able to survive." And the boy goes, "Yeah, right, wings." And the dad goes, "No, I'm telling you the truth." Daedalus says, "I'll do this." And sure enough, he builds the wings, puts them on the boy, and sure enough, the wings work. The minute that Icarus jumps, he is flying. It's incredible. Off he goes. Dad had told him, whatever you do, don't fly too close to the sun because the wings have wax on them. And if you go too close to the sun, melt the wax off the wings, you'll fall into the sea and you'll die. Icarus, like a lot of maybe younger kids, just interested in just doing it. Didn't want to listen to the advice. Flies too close to the sun. Wax comes off the wings. Into the ocean he goes. He dies. Let's point out at 2A, another possible message or theme is, sometimes when you're young and stupid or ignorant, You don't want to listen to the advice that's given to you by somebody older than you. Notice called in the story the old timer. Yeah, right. Old timers, what do they know? Remember earlier in the story, he even said that. Old timers don't travel alone when it's below 50 below. What? Look, I'm proving the old timer wrong. And at the very end of the story, he has to say to the old timer on page 610, "You were right, old boss. You were right." We could easily jump to 3B and ask, the last time that an old timer told you something and you went, "Yeah, whatever," and then you had to go, "Oh." Of course, sometimes it takes a little bit of time before we figure out that old timers often, not always, but often have something meaningful to say, don't they? Let's jump to 2B really quickly. We started out by pointing out that this is a story of conflict of both an internal and an external kind. Jot down, what is the internal conflict here between the character and himself? Obviously, the challenge to decide what's the right thing to do in survival mode, right? Can't get his fingers to work right. Things start breaking down physically for him. And then, of course, intellectually, what's the P word? And of course, all survival people say about this, no panic. Once you start panicking, what? You start making bad decisions, don't you? Of course, external conflict we've already mentioned, and we'll mention it one more time. This character versus nature story makes this a compelling story. From the early part of the story, you have a sense that things might not go very well for our poor guy, right? Notice he's never given a name. London just simply calls him what? The man, right? The man. In other words, this man kind of starts to become a symbol or representative of people in general who maybe think that they can somehow not listen to the voices of nature and can live it any way they want. Nature in the story, of course, in the end wins. And the dog kind of goes, "Oh well," and off he goes. Let's talk at level 3 how we can relate to a story like this. Obviously at 3A, this is a fairly simple one. Jot down for you the movies or the TV shows or the video games about your favorites, about survival. In other words, you're not going to make it unless you have some idea how to survive. We have lots of examples of these now on television, lots of these kind of survivor types of shows where, for example, an individual is out trying to find a way to survive in the wilderness or whatever. What is for you your favorite movie about making it through a terrible natural disaster? We're always having these films, right? Sometimes they don't make it, but sometimes they do make it, right? And finally, 3B. 2 questions. What is for you a time in your life that you had to survive, literally, physically, survive a pretty terrible experience? You had to maybe go through an experience that if you didn't get out of it, you would have died. Do you have an experience like that? Or somebody that you know? It might be maybe an adult in your life who tells you a story about, whoa, there was this time, right? It's not always the cold, is it? It can happen even in the heat, can't it, right? You can die in the badlands in the heat as well in the desert. But often it is the cold. Humans, of course, once they start getting really, really cold, and we're aware of this, aren't we, living up here close to mountains, you probably were preached to by a number of adults in your life. You have to be very careful when you go out for long periods of time. Driving distances, for example, without having the appropriate gear. If your car slides off the road, you could be dead before you're found if you don't have the proper kind of gear, right? Second question at 3B, let's write it down. For you, who is the old timer in your life who's given you some advice? Said things to you, and you maybe rolled your eyes. Hey, don't drop out of school. You better get that education, because if you don't have that education, you got a real challenge in your life. And you go, old timer, what do you know about it? Do you have a sense that there may be a moment in your life when you're going to say, you were right, old boss. You were right. Do you already have a moment in your life when you could say to an old-timer, you were right? Have you told that old-timer? If you can, You know what? You told me this once, and I didn't listen to you, and I should have, because you were right. The Daedalus Icarus story comes back in many ways, of course, to haunt any young person who sooner or later has got to admit, there's one or two things an old-timer told me that I probably should have listened to. Well, there you go. Jack London's classic To Build a Fire. Thank you.